So who was the greatest military leader ever in the history of ever? Well, one who could take the cake is Jan Zizka, undefeated in every battle he ever fought in, despite being half blind and then fully blind, all while revolutionising medieval warfare. Zizka burst onto the scene in 1419 during a Hussite uprising in Bohemia, where angry protesters in Prague yeeted Catholic councillors out of the window in what would become the first of 3 times in history people were thrown out of the window in Prague during an uprising. The Hussites were followers of Jan Hus, a Czech priest who had grown disillusioned with the corruption within the Catholic Church, especially them having 2 popes, even 3 at one point, and he began preaching for reformation. Of course the church didn't like this, denounced him as a heretic, and then burned him at the stake in 1415. The Hussites of course weren't too happy and began causing a ruckus, blaming one man, King Sigismund of Hungary, who invited Huss to a council under the guise of reform, but then handed him over to the Catholics for a barbecue, and now he was claiming he would drown every Hussite in Bohemia. His brother Wenceslaus IV was already king of Bohemia, however apparently the shock of the window yeeting caused him to pass away and now Siggy claimed the crown, which the Hussites were having none of. Sigismund wanting to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, which needed the Pope's approval, meant he cozied up to the Pope, and when the Pope called for a crusade against these heretics, Sigismund gladly accepted it, where in 1420 they besieged Prague. Enter our man Jan Zizka to lead the resistance, a 60-year-old grizzled veteran and a military genius who spent much of his early life as an outlaw and mercenary, losing the use of one eye at an early age, although it's unsure how, with the Zizka part of his name likely a reference to this as it wasn't a family name. His army was a bunch of peasants, craftsmen and farmers with little to no military training, although what they did know how to use was agricultural tools. One of Zizka's great innovations was to turn the agricultural flail into a weapon of war, as if you can beat your wheat, you can beat your meat. The meat in this situation being an armoured knight getting twatted round the head. He also armed them with weapons which required little to no training, such as crossbows and early firearms, with Zizka being one of the first innovators of gunpowder technology on the battlefield, and while it was still horribly inaccurate, it would have made even the hardest soldiers of the time shit their pants as it let off a terrifying roar. At Prague, with less than 100 troops, Zizka defended wooden fortifications atop Witkov Hill, which controlled the eastern route into the city, and the Crusaders, numbering 7,000 to 8,000, thought these Hussites were an absolute joke and this would be an easy battle. However, they probably hadn't heard of Zizka's undefeated record. The steepness of the hill funneled the Crusaders into one narrow path where apparently the ferocity of one woman Hussite soldier inspired their resistance, with reinforcements soon coming in on their flank and the Crusaders routing, with Hussites decisively beating them off and reclaiming Prague. While victory at Witkov was absolutely extraordinary, Zizka's real masterpiece came a few months before at the Battle of Neckmere and Sudomir, where he deployed one of the greatest battlefield innovations yet, which allowed a bunch of peasants to take on some of the finest knights in Europe. The wagenburg. The wagenburg was a bunch of cart wagons enhanced defensively and then chained together to form a defensive square or circle, and these were operated by teams of roughly 20 including crossbowmen, gunners, drivers, shield bearers, pikemen and then flare wielders with cannons in between them. Ditches were then dug in front of these wagons because of course a great leader like Zizka would know if you dig ditches you get bitches. Once morale of the enemy was completely broken, these wagons would then open up, unleashing hordes of angry, flail-wielding peasants to chase you down and beat you round the head, as the Hussites weren't too fond of chivalric codes and didn't take too many prisoners, meaning the armies that faced them suffered huge losses. Their religious war soon suffered its first hiccup though, as when besieging Raby Castle in 1421, Zizka suffered an arrow to his other eye, his good eye, and now he was completely blind in both eyes, taking him out of action for a few months. Sigismund now found this the perfect time to launch a second anti-Hussite crusade. At Kutna-Hora, it seems Zizka's string of victories was finally about to end, as he was sandwiched between a hostile town and Sigismund's forces. However, our man always has a plan, and at nightfall he aimed his cannons at the weakest point in Sigismund's line. After a significant gap was made, under the cover of darkness, Zizka rolled his war wagons through the line in the first mobile artillery move ever in history, escaping certain death, where he returned a few weeks later with reinforcements and crushed the crusading force. The Hussite movement was beginning to fracture though, between 2 rival factions, the Taborites, led by Zizka, who were more radical, and the Utraquists, who were more moderate in the reform they wanted. At the Battle of Malosov in 1423, Zizka beat the Utraquist force, because of course he did, he's Jan Zizka, he doesn't lose, and then he turned his attention east to liberate the Hussites in Moravia. However, this was one frontier too far, and Zizka finally lost the battle. To illness. With legend having it, he wanted his skin flayed and turned into a drum so he could still lead his men. And although this story is absolutely amazing, it probably isn't true. Zizka's troops now referred to themselves as the orphans upon loss of their leader, with the Hussite wars carrying on for a further 10 years where the moderate Hussites eventually won out and were able to practice their religion. His enemies said upon his passing, "The one whom no mortal hand could destroy was extinguished by the finger of God."